If you've spent any time in an art class, you probably had the following beat into your head at some point or another. Learn the fundamentals first. In some cases, this comes across in a different fashion. Don't draw manga, start with real life. Don't draw in Photoshop. Digital art is not real art. But all of it boils back to the basics, quite literally. But why? The fundamentals are boring, they take so much time, and after all, I really just want to draw dragons and robots. My name is Zach, and welcome to episode 78 of the podcast. Today, we are discussing the art fundamentals, why they were chosen, why they're important, and then understanding how or when to focus upon them. As usual, I'm going to explore what I mean by the topic, then go over how this might actually affect you as an artist, and I'm going to start adding in some of my own personal thoughts at the end as well, so please stay tuned for that. Feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon linked below as we get started. Did you ever have an art teacher who pushed the fundamentals on you? Was it good or was it painful? Did you understand where they were coming from and did they explain themselves? Please let us know in the comments below. Well, to get started, what are the fundamentals? And why do art teachers focus on them so much? The fundamentals are the absolute basic things that you need in order to begin making art. In fact, most of us will learn a great deal about them before we ever really figure out what they are or put names to them. It is difficult to find a full or agreed upon list, but when most talk about the fundamentals, they mean something akin to these: line, shape, form, value, color, texture, and space. Sometimes these will extend into more abstract concepts, even going so far as things like composition, storytelling, anatomy, perspective, and proportion. And I think there is a good logic to include these here as well, but if you do, the former list is still more fundamental than these. You cannot, for example, practice and understand perspective until you have at least a functional, solid handle on line, shape, form, and space. Well, why then do teachers focus so heartily on these kind of boring topics? At a really rudimentary level, it makes sense. When you start teaching elementary math or reading, you have to start with the basics. But if you've ever been in a classroom where it feels like the teacher has focused on this for far too long, well, that's going to be part of what we're dissecting today. It's a pretty easy question to answer, actually, in lieu of the things we just talked about as well, especially coming from me as a teacher. In order to properly handle the more complicated topics, you of course need to practice and understand their constituent parts. Line equips you for basically everything else. Value allows you to shade and show three-dimensionality. Perspective allows you to make things feel as if they fit in the real world, and so on. These are the building blocks, the foundation of art making itself. Teachers tend to focus on these things because in a perfect world, you would spend time learning the elementary components so well that you would be able to move on to whatever else it is that you want to pursue. The reality is different, however, as most students would obviously become quite bored if they were required to focus on the fundamentals only for a very long period of time. And that might actually touch upon why art teachers focus on this so heartily. Students often push forward to do what is fun rather than learn their fundamentals. Most students have an idea of what they want to produce, and they rush toward it, but diving in, find that they lack the needed skills to do what they desire. Teachers know this, have seen it hundreds of times before, and really just want to equip students with the skills to achieve their goals. At least that's what good teachers do. Those that aren't simply bent on shoving every kid through the rigorous structure they had to endure on their journey. So, that out of the way, let's start exploring a little bit more about the fundamentals. Not necessarily going in depth about each, though if that's what you would like, please let me know in the comments. Instead, today, I want to focus on why they were chosen, or why we landed upon them as an art community, why they are important, and then understanding how or when to focus upon them. So why were these things chosen? Well, like I mentioned earlier, they are actually fundamental. I want to take a moment and talk about what I think are the first two, the most important two, which are line and value. Line allows you, obviously, to actually make the first iterations of things. It seems to be that line is where most artists start, either in current day when you watch children learning, Or even if you look back at some really, really old ancestral pieces of work that we as a society put together. Shape probably comes in conjunction with this, but really delineating between line and shape is going to be kind of difficult sometimes because it doesn't take a lot of lines to give you a shape. Form, obviously, is where you pull that into 3 dimensions and becomes a little bit different. But even if we're throwing shape in here, we have line, shape, and value. And these 3 will pretty much give you the ability to represent anything you could want to represent on a flat surface. And generally, in my mind, we as humans seem to start with 2-dimensional art rather than 3-dimensional. Though there might be some art historians among us who are going to go back and talk about how some of the oldest art, in fact, probably the oldest pieces of art that we have as a culture, are 3-dimensional. But I think that a lot of that happens because those objects withstood the test of time. I would wager that our ancestors first began putting down art as a 2-dimensional thing, probably drawing on cave walls or any other source that they had to do so. But these things are fundamental. They are absolutely foundational to the structure of making art. I don't think that there was a council who sat down at one point and decided, we need to come up with a list of things that people should have to do first. It isn't a licensure thing. It's just a simple reality. If you want to make 2-dimensional art, then focusing on honing your skills with line weight, line length, line thickness, how lines are applied, lines when they're parallel, perpendicular, lines used as hatching, lines used as scribbles to build up to value. As you master those things, you are going to have the ability to do more. The second you take those lines and you warp them and construct them into shapes, you now can create symbols. And this is something we see very early on, both in children and in human history. Symbols and shapes are incredibly important. Some of the first things my daughter really wrapped her head around was just drawing a couple shapes. Hearts were one of the first that she had outside of circles and squares and things like that. And those become symbols. In fact, we use symbols like this all the time. So often we don't even always recognize them. Different kinds of shapes, like an octagon that is red means stop. A triangle that is yellow means maybe stop. This is how humans work. Those lines quickly become shapes. And if you just had line and shape and that's all you could use artistically, you would be fine. But the second you start introducing value, you can imply 3-dimensionality. You can imply that these objects exist not on a flat surface, but they exist in a theoretical, abstract, ethereal, 3-dimensional surface upon a 2-dimensional surface. You can start shading. So an object can exist above another object, behind another object. And this is going to start pulling in concepts like space. And you can see very quickly how each of these will interact with one another. These were not chosen arbitrarily. They are just simply the building blocks of art, the things that you have to focus upon if you really truly want to hone those skills. Line, shape, form, value, color. I think once we get to color and texture, things become a little bit more ethereal. You can obviously produce really good art that never has any color or texture to it. Texture is this weird pseudo-implied thing in 2-dimensional drawing, but an actual physical thing when it comes to 3-dimensional art. And then when you work with painting, it's somewhere in between. If you look at Van Gogh's paintings, they have this massive impasto, this built-up physical texture of the paint. Does that contribute to the piece? Absolutely. When you look at pieces like Starry Night or his sunflowers online, you don't get that. But when you get to see those pieces in person or pieces like them, they are distinctly different depending on the light that's coming in, and most of the time they're in museums, so they're lit exactly the same way every single day. But if you have a piece that has impasto like that hangs in your house, the light throughout the day casts different shadows from the actual paint texture, and the painting will change and shift. And it's a crazy, very interesting and cool thing. So these fundamentals were not arbitrarily chosen. They are simply the components, the building blocks of art in general. And this is why then they receive so much focus. Focusing on the fundamentals then as a teacher, you have to cast your net wide. You are trying to serve the normal, the average student in a room. And so if you focus on these things, they're going to serve the greatest majority of your populace, of your student body, the best. In teaching, especially when developing curriculum, you're casting this wide net, trying to take care of as many people as possible. Will these be perfect for every artist? No, they cannot be. But the process of learning and mastering each of these skills will help every artist achieve their goals. And I firmly believe this, even if you are a three-dimensional artist, that focusing on concepts like value and line are still valuable to you. I didn't intend for that to be punny, but it kind of just happened. When you sculpt something, you don't have to imply the line. Like, it has lines to it. It has outlines to it. Sometimes you can actually etch in and have physical lines on your sculpture. It also has real value in that it has darkness and shading whenever something is going to be affected by light. You don't have to artificially construct that in the same way that you do when you're drawing something. However, you have to construct the boundaries that create that value in those lines. You have full control over that. If you're building something out of metal, you can spend a lot of time thinking about where your shadows are going to be cast. In fact, you can even create a sculpture that creates the art by casting its shadow at different times of the day, perhaps onto the ground. So that's kind of how we ended up with this list. And I am today just going to focus on these basics. I'll keep alluding to the more complicated fundamentals like perspective, but really, for this podcast, I think we're focusing on the simpler ones. If you want to hear more about the others, just let me know. But why are these ones so important? Obviously, they are the foundational building blocks. And I think for any one of you who is listening who has built up a skill before, whether artistic or otherwise, you understand that you have to have these basic elements. I am currently in the process of teaching my 5.5-year-old daughter math and reading. And there are so many fundamental components that she needs in order to do that. The English language is a hard language to learn at first because nothing follows any of the rules. You learn how all these letters are pronounced, how the combinations are pronounced. And then my poor little girl looks at me and goes, "How do I pronounce this word, Daddy?" And she's looking at the word sugar. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, that certainly looks like it's sugar. It shouldn't be an SH sound. And obviously, like, English has inherited all these words from so many places that you have a lot of words that don't follow their own rules. And it makes it really, really difficult. Hopefully, artistically, as you learn these fundamentals, these little individual pieces will obey and listen and follow their own rules. They will equip you with the ability to do greater things. As you master line, you equip yourself with the ability to begin working on perspective. Each of these skills, when they are in their infancy, will kind of bump into one another and they won't coordinate really well. But as they fall in line, as you understand them, as they come to obey you, then they will become amazing tools that you can use. Each skill builds on what came before as well and allows you to do new things in the future. This is both as a singular skill, like the skill of line, the skill of value, but all of them in tandem as well. As you continue to hone just your skill working with value, then that builds on all of the prior versions of it. Each of these could be something you focus on for an entire year. You could take a year, though I wouldn't do this, but you could take a year and do nothing but focus on shading and value. And if you are far enough along in your artistic journey, that would not be a waste. There are lots of artists who focused on line, though not quite in the way that you might initially assume. A lot of those focuses are creating implied lines in their pieces. In fact, if you look at most movie posters, well, maybe not the ones today, but if you look at traditional movie posters, book covers, and a lot of comic books, there's almost always this implied line. Sometimes it's just the outstretched limb of some character. Line is a powerful, basic human component to art making and symbolism, and so we look for it even if we don't know that we are. When you begin to take on large-scale projects that utilize not only the basic fundamentals, but the more complicated conceptual ones as well, you will be balancing too many things if you don't understand most of them innately. And this is probably the number one reason to focus on the fundamentals, to focus on individual components and continue to develop them regardless of where you are on your journey. Think about speaking or learning a new language. At first, there is so much thought that has to occur to you as you move things around in your mind, translating, rephrasing, remembering where the adjectives go in this particular tongue. Over time, however, it becomes more like second nature. This is true with the fundamentals of art as well. I don't think about line or value as active things most of the time I draw now. They're more innate. They still come up eventually, But I tend to focus more on perspective, on composition, on what is being achieved by the conglomerate effect of all of the things that I'm working on. This is true for all the other fundamentals as well. In fact, you can practice something like perspective enough that it doesn't even really occur to you. You're just going to draw something that fits into that scene and it's going to follow all of the rules. This is something that when you are watching other artists draw, in fact, it might even happen as you're watching me draw here, and it certainly happens for me when I watch other artists. You watch what they're doing and you don't understand all of what's happening inside their mind. I can look at my drawing and know what I'm considering, why I'm pausing for a moment here and there. But you likely can't, because we all come from different backgrounds. We all come from different places in our journey. And so you can't necessarily hone in on what I am thinking about and having to consider and what I'm not. There are certain aspects of the drawing that just kind of happen. If I had somebody stop me right now, for example, and ask, why are you adding all those pieces of texture on the, junkyard in the background in that particular way? I'm not sure I could tell you. I am just pausing and taking a look and adding marks where I feel like they should be. Now, there was a day way back in the past where I was thinking about and analyzing texture and value and line and having to consider those things more heavily. But now, I'm not having to in the same way. Every time I redouble my focus and I come back, and especially recently as I've been doing a lot more educational content on inking strategies, I am considering these things more heartily. This is also why you've heard me talk in the past about the importance of teaching others, because it redoubles your focus. It forces you to understand things in a different way, in a more hearty fashion. The more you focus on the fundamentals, the more they become background, the more they become innate in how you process art. But how long should you focus on them? Now we come to some of the tougher topics here. There is a temptation to focus on the fundamentals eternally, or to skip past them altogether. I've certainly watched both manner of students in the past, and have honestly done both of these at different points in my life. It's very easy to think that you are doing the right thing as an artist by eternally practicing the fundamentals, getting as good as you can at anatomy, as good as you can at perspective. In fact, in a recent video, I talked a little bit more about this, so I won't drone on too much. But the idea here is that the fundamentals are there to serve a purpose. They are not the purpose in and of themselves. They are tools to equip you to do greater things. If you focus on them, and I understand why you might do this, why you might spend a ton of time focusing on the fundamentals, it keeps you from doing the scary things. It keeps you from diving into things that could fail. When you're practicing, what is failure when it comes to practice? It's very hard to determine. And you can trick yourself into thinking that you are taking the road less traveled. You are buckling down. You're doing the hard thing. But in reality, what you're doing is avoiding the actual thing. Practice in and of itself is not an end. The fundamentals are not an end in and of themselves. They are constituent pieces that allow you to build greater things. But the other side is all too common as well, and was very, very common when I was working with younger students. They got excited. They didn't want to spend all this time, this grueling time from their perspective, learning perspective, learning composition, learning how to draw trees, how to draw mountains, how to make their marks in a way that made sense, how to mix their colors appropriately. Just give me the container of green. I don't want to mix it. This is understandable, especially if you're young. You are probably impulsive and you have a desire to get to the dopamine fix, to the exciting thing as quickly as possible. This happens a lot. But the reason that it's important to avoid that temptation is because you will find yourself neck deep in problems that you can't solve. You will run into not knowing how to use perspective appropriately in this situation. You will run into not understanding how these forms would overlap. You won't know what kinds of lines to use. You won't know how to shade this thing. It's better to practice those in a smaller, more controlled, sometimes even more contrived scenario. And this is hopefully what your teachers are doing if you have teachers still. They're hopefully trying to construct scenarios that are going to equip you with the abilities to do greater things and not hang you out to dry. That's what you end up doing, though, if you dive into things too quickly, if you try to escape the fundamentals. And most artists, I would say, especially in the United States, most artists do this in their younger years. They dive into whatever is new and flashy, and they just keep moving through it. And the desire is just to have that excitement, to feel that rush from diving into making their comic or doing the concept art. But the reality is, you have to find a balance between these two. That focusing on one extreme or the other is not going to avail you in the long run. So how long should you focus on them? If we're avoiding these two extremes, obviously we're going for somewhere in the middle. I suppose the quick answer is you should always focus on the fundamentals. And therefore, the more correct question to ask is, what portion of your time should be invested into the fundamentals? This is going to be determined by how much time you've invested in the past, by where you are on your artistic journey. But I think it is important to understand and acknowledge that you never really get past them. You never have 100% mastery of any of these things. If you are early on in your journey, let's say you're just beginning to draw or paint or sculpt right now, I think probably 75% of your artistic time should be focused on the fundamentals, on practicing these quote unquote boring things. But you should always be taking some time to focus on the things that are exciting, the things that you want to do artistically. So if you are, let's say you're starting today, your goal is to learn how to be a good, proficient drawer today, and you're starting. Great, welcome. But I would immediately start focusing on those fundamentals, on learning how to handle line, learning how to draw boxes, learning how to construct forms and shapes and how they interact, and spend a lot of time doing those things. But very quickly, I would then turn that and start to work on things that are enjoyable to you. You will not have the skills to make a comic book inside of a couple weeks or a couple months. But that doesn't mean that you can't start making a very small diminutive version of that. Let's assume you did want to make a comic. You did want to work on concept art. Let's start with the first one though. If you wanted to make a comic, then even a couple days into your artistic journey, start just drawing some really poorly put together, silly 1-panel or 4-panel little comics. You see these things on Instagram all the time. They show up sometimes on YouTube, but it doesn't have to be pretty. You could literally have your characters have no head, just be a torso that is a circle with some emotive qualities to their face, and you could just draw sticks for their limbs. Start with something though, something that is going to pull you through the tough times. As you move on, you will pretty quickly, I think, if you were gonna, let's say you're drawing an hour a day, every day, I would say after about 3 to 6 months, you should start shifting toward only focusing about 50% of your time on the fundamentals. The other 50% is then on things that you enjoy, just totally random drawing, and then start introducing larger projects that are actually giving you the ability to hone these skills. I find that if you focus too much just on the fundamentals and drawing for joy, that you will often not push those fundamental skills. And that's why I've had a couple podcasts here recently and talks recently about big projects and their necessity. I'll actually link that below in the description. It's important to have these big projects, I think, because it requires more of you than practice will, and it requires different things than just making a fun drawing in your sketchbook will. Those things will innately push you and will often force you to combine a lot of fundamental elements together. As you continue to progress, maybe let's assume you're kind of where I am. I'd say probably about 25% of my artistic time should be spent on the fundamentals. Now I say should be because I don't think I spend that. I probably spend closer to 10 or 15%, but that is just my current iteration. A couple years back, it was 85% of the time, and so I struggle with that balance as well. If you have been at this for a while, you're still looking to hone your skills, you need to spend probably a quarter of your time focusing on the fundamentals. Now, the fun part is that you don't have to focus on your fundamentals by just doing sheet upon sheet of practice at this point. You can actually start having projects and designing projects that are built specifically to hone a skill. And I think at this point, it is more beneficial to you as an artist to actually build larger things. Projects that might take you several weeks or several months to complete. Things like Inktober, like Smogist, March of the Robots, maybe putting together a draft for a book, whatever it might be. These projects will hone different skills and will lead you into like a second or third level of the fundamentals. As you push past this point, you're probably going to get to a place where you have such a good understanding of the fundamentals that you touch upon them periodically. And in this sense, it's probably going to be refreshing. I know a lot of the really good, really skillful artists in my life will every once in a while just take a sketchbook and work on a fundamental technique, color mixing, or value. Sometimes, if they're an oil painter, they'll do a series of paintings that are only in black and white, just removing color from their consideration. And this is often very relaxing because it's so much less complicated than all the other art that they do. So if you are a very proficient artist, it can be a welcome break from everything else you're working on to go back and just work on a fundamental skill for a while. But you never really grow out of it. You never get to this point where you don't need to work on the fundamentals. You could get to a point where you chose not to. But if you have a desire to continually improve and to produce art, I would encourage you to never stop focusing on the fundamentals, to keep honing your understanding of value, of shape, and form. These things are worthwhile endeavors, and they will always improve your artistic skills. My final point here was actually called, How do you know when you're ready to go beyond the basics? But I think, as we've covered in my rambles over the course of the last few minutes, you never really go beyond them. You do continue to hone them and push them in intricate ways, but it's this long-term gradient. Slowly, the amount of time that you focus on your fundamentals will be exchanged for the amount of time you focus on your loves and your joy. And that's kind of an exciting thing. It's a transition that you as an artist will make over time. I think some of us make it rather naturally. I know I kind of had to choose to. I had to choose to turn away from my overt focus on skills and fundamentals and start working on actual pieces. And to be honest, it was scary at first. But the amount of joy that I get out of my drawings now is tremendously higher than it used to be. And that would actually be the last thing that I want to leave you with. In all this talk about the fundamentals, how important they are nowhere near as important as continued joy in your art making. If they are your only focus, then you probably won't have enough joy to continue making art. There has to be a reason that you get up each day, that you sit down to actually make a thing. And if there's no fun in it, if there's no joy, if there's no satisfaction in it, you won't keep coming back and probably shouldn't. So always take some time to focus on the things that bring you happiness, the things that bring you joy. Well, what are my thoughts about this? I suppose they've kind of come out as we've talked through the entire episode, that I am a very structural person. I like to keep spreadsheets. I like to track everything. I have lists for everything that I can imagine. So for me, it was very comfortable for a long time to overtly focus on the fundamentals. And I felt like I was doing a good job, like I was being very productive. And after about 6 months to a year of that, I had this really terrible realization that though my individual skills in these individual arenas had progressed, that I couldn't make a better drawing, that I couldn't make a better painting. I had to start balancing the amount of time that I was investing in learning the fundamentals and then actually applying it in my own work before it really started to impact anything. I even took a couple classes with Marshall Vandruff, who's a wonderful teacher and such a lovely human being. But until I took the things I learned there and started applying them to robots and to buildings and to dragons and creatures and monsters, none of it really stuck and none of it really mattered. So for me, it's been a difficult process, and I do struggle with some of the regrets of like, why didn't I wrap my head around this earlier? It's one of those hard things though. I spent so long teaching other people and focusing on helping them achieve their dreams. And in the meantime, I forgot to do this for myself. I'm very fortunate and happy that I had this realization at about 36 years old, that now I hopefully will have another 36 years to actually work on my own dreams. And I'm also, satisfied and happy with the fact that I spent a long time encouraging other people to follow theirs and hopefully equipping them with the ability to do so. But that's my perspective on this. What about yours? If you haven't already shared any thoughts below, I would love to hear them. And if you're looking for an artistic community, I would encourage you to check out our Discord server, where we can talk about things like this, where you can share the art that you're working on. And if you've been at this for a while, then hopefully you can be of some assistance and some help for some of the younger artists there as well. Well, as always, thanks for being here. And thanks to my patrons as well, who are on the screen. If you want to check out the Patreon, it gives you access to some exclusive updates and videos, but mostly it just helps you support me here at the channel. And I really appreciate all of you. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.